Hello, guys and gals, and welcome. Welcome. So today we're going to be talking about a topic which has only really come up because of the reign of the Warlock Heralds having access to Thorns. This is something specific to the new seasons, or rather the new expansion, or whatever you want to call it, that never existed before. And I thought maybe it would be a good idea to go over a video and talk about Thorns. Also, to clarify how Thorns works and also the different versions of Thorns that exist. So first off, let's just type in Thorns. Thorns is the aura from the Paladin, and it's the one specifically that you're going to have to deal with on the Heralds. There is also Iron Maiden. There is Spirit of the Barbs. And although technically it's already in this mix, there is also Attacker takes damage of. And we're going to clarify the difference between some of these things as we go forward. Now, Thorns specifically is actually both. And so we need to go over both sides of how Thorns works and essentially how you can protect yourself against it. Now, the most important thing about Thorns that you need to know is that Thorns only reflects physical melee damage. That's it. And this is very specific. And to put this into a more of a even more specific category is that it can be melee but not physical, and it will not reflect. It can be physical but not melee, and it will not reflect. It has to be both melee and physical. Now, to further clarify this, there are many different forms of damage types in the game. There are ranged attacks, like, for instance, multi-shot, or let's say freezing arrow. This would be considered a ranged attack, and ranged attacks do not reflect thorns. There are also spells. Anything that is considered a spell, like, for instance, a Nova or Fireball, these do not reflect thorns. More specifically, there are also melee attacks that do not reflect thorns. Like, for instance, you can have things like Berserk that will not reflect thorns, and this is because it is magic damage. There is no physical component to the way that it works. The thing is that there's more than one type of thorns. There are actually two types of thorns. There is the reflection, and there is also the attacker takes damage of, or ATDO. Attacker takes damage of is a different calculation than the regular calculation. And we're going to talk about both of those together and how they differ from each other, and why, when you're fighting a Herald who has both, you need to understand how both work and what to do about them. Now, if you look at Thorns has a returned damage part. The 250% returned is the reflection. That is where it takes your damage and reflects it back to you, or in the case of a monster who's hitting you, it takes their damage and reflects them back to them. It actually multiplies it in the process when it does it. Now, Thorns used to work the same in PvE as it did in PvP back in the day before they nerfed it. And when it did, it was extraordinarily deadly. In fact, it was so deadly that, like, if you had a whirlwinding barbarian coming at you, you could simply switch to Thorns and usually kill them in the process. Without even really putting any significant bonuses into Thorns because of how much it would reflect. There were some changes, though, from obviously that, so that they made it so that the PvP version was nerfed into oblivion. So if you're thinking about the way the PvP version works right now with Thorns, it doesn't work that way at all, because that is a gimped version. The truth is that Thorns is extraordinarily deadly to physical damage attackers. It is also extraordinarily deadly to fast attackers. So while the reflection reflects and multiplies your damage, And this one is, of course, based on the fact that you're doing physical. Attacker takes damage of doesn't care if you're doing physical. It doesn't care if you're doing any type of damage. It just cares that you make a melee attack. And also, due to changes in the Diablo 2 Resurrected, they changed the way that attacker takes damage of works. So it used to only apply damage to the target if you hit the target. That means that you would have to successfully make a physical attack and pass the monster's defense and land a blow to cause the attacker takes damage of to land back on you. However, now that is no longer the case. Attacker takes damage of will now apply damage to you for an attempt. This means that you do not have to actually hit the target. It will automatically apply the set amount of damage to you. Now, attacker takes damage of is actually extraordinarily deadly to fast attackers. So if you have fast attack speed, in fact, it generally tends to kill fast attackers because you will attack at a very quick pace, applying the damage in a very quick pace to yourself. For instance, let me give you an example. Let's say, for instance, a monster had 256 attacker takes damage of, and then you attack, say, 2 times per second. Well, then you're going to take 512 damage. Now let's assume that they have 256 damage per attacker takes damage of, but you attack at like 4.5 frame zeal. Now you're taking 1,152 damage in a second in that same time period. So fast attackers tend to take more damage for attacker takes damage of than the latter. They also function differently in that attacker takes damage of can work even if you block and various other things. So like it still applies no matter what. If you block an attack, it applies. If you dodge an attack, it applies. If your defense completely prevents an attack, it still applies. Attacker takes damage of in its current form applies to the monster no matter what, as long as it is a melee attack. Now, this is the important thing about attacker takes damage of, is it does require melee. It's the same thing as Thorns. So with attacker takes damage of, there's no real way to avoid it entirely as a melee character. However, with the reflection, you can avoid the reflection part by just simply not having the physical part, and I totally misspelled physical there. That is the worst spelling of physical I think I've ever made. Physical, I think that's correct. So basically, when you're dealing with Thorns, there's 2 different aspects of Thorns that you have to deal with. Now, if we take the other versions of Thorns and we rank them. So let's rank the different versions of Thorns and what they do. So Iron Maiden is only reflect. Thorns is reflect and attacker takes damage of. And then we also have Spirit of the Barbs. Spirit of the Barbs is not reflect. It is only ATDO. So it is attacker takes damage of only. Now, attacker takes damage of can be gotten from other sources as well, and this is also something that you might want to pay attention to, and it does actually stack with other sources. So, for instance, in the world, you may eventually come across a Thorn Beast. And there is also a possibility that a Thorn Beast or a Quill Rat or whatever you want to call them, there's a bunch of different names for these guys, they actually have attacker takes damage of built into them. A rather large amount, actually. And if they have thorns, the attacker takes damage of from the thorns will combine together with the attacker takes damage of from the Thorn Beast, which means that you will have the combination of the 2. I've actually built an entire character around attacker takes damage of, and it's pretty crazy. The beautiful thing about attacker takes damage of is that you don't have to get hit, because it applies whether the monster makes an attempt or not, whether they succeed or not, it always applies. Whereas the reflection only applies if you have a successful hit. Think about it like this. The reflection part of Thorns, the part that states 250% damage returned, requires a hit to then multiply. This means that the reflection part of the Thorns cannot function without a successful hit. However, the attacker takes damage of doesn't care whether you hit the target and just simply applies anyway. This means that in general, when you're dealing with one of these heralds, like for instance, if you run along and you happen to find a herald that is Thorns, so you have a Thorns herald, how do you deal with this as a melee character? And this is the question. How do you deal with this as a melee character? Now, they did just recently patch a bug with the Herald Thorns where it was applying twice. So apparently there was a bug where the Herald Thorns was actually applying its damage twice to the target instead of a single time, which was probably making them even more deadly than they were before. But let's ignore that for the time being. We're just going to focus on how you can essentially deal with a monster that has thorns in a safe manner. Well, the first thing that you're going to want to do is you definitely don't want to hit them with a strong melee attack. This is the first and foremost thing that you don't want to do. If you hit them with a very strong physical melee attack, you are going to kill yourself almost instantly. It's not even a question. So you have to switch to something that is not a melee attack or switch to something that is not a physical attack. If you take one of the two out of the equation, usually you can make it work. So this means that you're going to need something that is a ranged attack or spell. And I can give some examples. Or you are going to need something that is an elemental damage ability or magic damage ability. Let's take some examples here and let's come up with some solutions. So let's say you're a barbarian that primarily does like frenzy. All right. Well, one thing that you could easily do is you could utilize double throw. So a very easy solution for this, you already have points into it. You could potentially utilize some throwing weapons and you could just simply throw weapons at the target. The reason why this works is because double throw is a ranged attack. Right? It's not a melee attack, which means that it bypasses the reflection and you won't have to worry about any damage coming in. It puts you in a safe distance and you can continue to do damage to the target until it's dead. It's very effective. It still does physical damage. It's just doing physical ranged damage, which is a slight difference. It works. You could also potentially utilize Berserk. If you have 1 point in Berserk, Berserk is a magic damage attack. It converts 100% of all the physical damage to magic damage, which allows you to bypass the reflection, because now you are no longer doing physical damage. You are no longer going to have the reflection part. However, with Berserk, you are still going to have the attacker takes damage of part, which will deal steady damage to you every single time you swing your weapon, so do keep that in mind. Another potential way that you could deal with it is you could do spell damage. So something like Warcry would potentially work. So Warcry is a spell that allows you to bypass the thorns in another way, which also could potentially let you stun the target. If you're a paladin, let's use a paladin as an example, and let's pretend you are a zeal paladin. Most zeal paladins tend to be physical damage. However, there are a lot of weapons out there that do not have good physical damage on them. A backup weapon of sorts. The easiest way to handle this would be to utilize a weapon which is primarily non-physical. There are a lot of non-physical choices. Some of them are actually surprisingly cheap. One very good, extremely low physical damage weapon is Lawbringer. Lawbringer has basically 0 physical damage. It is known as a ZDPS weapon because it is a 0 physical ZP-DPS weapon, and there's a bunch of ZP-DPS weapons like this that exist. Lawbringer just happens to be one of them. But when you play around with some of these, you'll notice that they have a large amount of elemental damage. Some of them have magical damage, but they have very little in the way of actual physical damage, so they won't really reflect that much back to you. Another interesting choice could potentially be like a lightsaber. I believe lightsaber has decently low physical damage, although I wouldn't call it a ZP DPS. It's low enough that you probably won't kill yourself, and it has more elemental damage than not. You could also potentially utilize something like Holy Shock, which applies large amounts of elemental damage. Holy Freeze. Holy Fire, etc. These are all good choices. You could also potentially just simply put on a bow and fire at the target. If you happen to be a Holy Fire character, for instance, you may have a Demon Machine set up specifically with Holy Fire that you can utilize for ranged attacks. It actually works surprisingly well for Holy Fire. Because it adds the Holy Fire damage to the exploding arrow, which allows you to dish out damage at range. There are some interesting options. Another interesting choice for the Paladin would simply be using Conversion. Conversion allows you to convert monsters to help deal with a target. Conversion doesn't really do any damage, and it will convert targets, which will then deal with the problem for you. Conversion could potentially be a very powerful ally against Thorns, because basically all you're going to do is run up and convert every single monster that you can possibly convert, have those monsters attack the Herald for you, and just see what happens when the dust settles. There's also obviously spell options. So for spell options, we have things like Holy Bolt. If the monster is an undead or a demon, there is a possibility that it might not be an undead or a demon. You could also potentially utilize Blessed Hammer, which is also a spell option and does not reflect. I would not recommend, so do not recommend Vengeance. Vengeance is not completely elemental. It is actually a physical damage skill. It's 25... I would say it's about 25% physical, 25% fire, 25% cold, 25% lightning. It's about an equal mix of just about everything. And I have tested this with Thorns. I did. And Vengeance still does enough physical damage that it will still kill you. So do be aware that Vengeance is maybe not the best choice out there. Fist of the Heavens also would work. So you could also put Fist of the Heavens on this list. FOH. Let's look at Warlock. So Warlock is an interesting one. So Warlock, let's pretend you are running a Warlock and you were doing like a cleave build, or maybe you were doing a melee mirrored blades. Melee mirror blades and cleave are both susceptible to Thorns. You could, however, utilize ranged mirrored blades, which is actually a really good option. Very easy way to bypass the Thorns. However, if you didn't want to have a bow on you, you could also use Echoing Strike. Echoing Strike is also technically counted as like a ranged ability and does not seem to reflect Thorns, so Echoing Strike could also potentially be an option. You could also focus specifically on magic damage and elemental damage as opposed to physical damage, which is actually pretty easy to do on the Warlock because you can utilize things like the... I'm trying to think here off the top of my head. The Hexbane and Hex Purge. Hexbane and Hex Purge are both very good for dishing out magic damage. And that magic damage obviously is not going to reflect. So if you have primarily magic damage and you have very little physical damage, you could even potentially attack them with a melee attack and not really take very much damage. It really depends on how high the physical damage is on the weapon that you're using. Versus something else. Like, for instance, if you were utilizing something like a Lawbringer, which has relatively zero physical damage, you could potentially swing it quite quickly with your magic damage and not really worry too much about the Thorns. Trying to think if there's any other good... let's say Druid. So Druid might be an interesting one. Let's pretend you are a shape shifter Druid. Shapeshifter Druids don't really have as many good options as the other characters. Technically, you could be a bear and stun. You basically use Shockwave. You could basically just spam Shockwave until the thing is dead. It would probably take a very long time, to be perfectly honest. I don't really think there's a lot of good options for the shapeshifting werewolf, though. They're all melee attacks, and they all do high physical damage. So the only option, really, for the shapeshifter druid would be to have a ZP DPS weapon in reserve. ZDPS weapons are not really that hard to come by. They tend to be things like an edge bow, which has ZDPS. Lawbringer has ZDPS. They don't really do very much damage, though. So you have to get the damage from other sources, which means you have to do things like lightning damage or fire damage. Fireclaw could be a good option, come to think of it, actually. You know, I don't even know why I didn't think about Fireclaw. So Fireclaw is probably going to be one of the best options for a Shapeshifter Druid in general, because that's going to allow you to deal primarily fire damage, which is, of course, going to bypass the problem. It's not really that complicated to bypass the Thorns. You just have to have a plan in motion for the Thorns when it appears. My suggestion to everybody is that as you're building your character and you're trying to think about how you want your character to be set up, if you're trying to build a melee character, and you need to answer the question, how do I deal with the Thorns? So that's one of the questions that you are going to have to answer, is how do you deal with Thorns as a melee character? And the answer is actually a lot simpler than you would think. I mean, it really comes down to the fact that you just don't stop hitting them with your big giant melee physical damage. Physical damage is the main problem with these builds, and attack speed is also the secondary problem when it comes to attacker takes damage of. In fact, I've killed myself on attacker takes damage of a lot with elemental characters that don't really leech as much, but attack extremely quickly. Like, for instance, if you set up a Holy Shock Paladin, like, for instance, my Godzilla, as an example. This is a Holy Shock Paladin that does primarily elemental damage. And because he does primarily elemental damage, he doesn't necessarily need to worry about the reflection part of it because he has very little damage to reflect. In fact, I've been able to successfully kill Thorns Heralds with this character because he has very little physical damage at all. In fact, if I turn off my aura, as you can see I have 17k damage, if I turn off my aura, you'll see that my damage goes down to a pitiful 680 physical damage, and I think there's even some poison damage in there. Bringing that up a little bit more, as well as like things like the Raven Frost. So for the most part, when you look at my character, I have very little physical damage. However, I do attack extremely fast because I'm using a Phase Blade with increased attack speed. And so if I'm in one of those situations where I'm fighting the Thorns character, I do have to pace myself a little bit, which is also something that you need to understand when it comes to both attacker takes damage of, and also the other reflection. So pacing yourself is very important, otherwise you will kill yourself. Pacing the damage output so it does not exceed your recovery. And this is sometimes difficult because the Thorns that's coming out of the monster, the attacker takes damage of, and whatever small amount of reflect that is left, even if you remove most of your physical damage, you're still going to have some. So you're going to be taking damage per hit, and the more hits you do, the faster you will kill yourself. So sometimes what you have to do is you just have to take it slow. You might have to do like 3 or 4 hits, and then heal, and then 4 or 5 hits, and then heal, and so forth and so on. You can get a large amount of life leech, which can help with this, but depending on the type of monster, you might not be able to life leech them at all. If you're not outright killing yourself, another interesting thing that you could potentially do is utilize life tap. Life tap will help. Only if you don't kill yourself. This is kind of important, is that life tap doesn't prevent you from dying, it only heals you when you hit yourself. And if you hit yourself too quickly and you dish out too much damage so that the life tap can't overcome the negative, then what happens is you'll just instantly die. And in the case of Thorns, if you're doing a really large amount of physical damage, you will just kill yourself. Life tap will not save you. But when you get into a situation like, for instance, my little Godzilla here, which doesn't really do very much physical damage at all, but he does do a large amount of elemental damage, he's still taking some damage in the process. And so you can potentially offset some of that by applying life tap. The only problem with life tap is that if it does work, that's great, but sometimes you need to break the immunities of a monster, right? So like if a monster is immune to your specific element, it could be bad. But let's talk about that, right? So amplify damage and decrepify, as well as any other source of negative physical resistance. These are your enemy. If you're trying to deal with a physical damage character, these will kill you. The reason is because they are going to increase the physical damage that the monster takes, and in the process, they are going to increase the amount of reflection. Think about it like this. If you do 1,000 damage to a target, and amplify damage multiplies that by 2 to 2,000, and the Thorns is like 500% increase of your 2,000, and then that ends up being like some crazy amount of damage that comes back, and you'll just end up one-shotting yourself. So like 2,000 plus 500%, and it'll end up being like 12,000 damage coming back to you. All right? You don't want to put yourself in a situation where the Thorns one-shots you, because if you get to that point, if the Thorns is just one-shotting you, then there's nothing you can do. If you can't make at least one attack on the target without instantaneous death, then obviously these things are going to cause that. That's very bad. You got to put yourself into a situation where you can actually attack the target multiple times without death, and even if you can get away, recover a little bit, and come back, it should work. Stopping the monster's regeneration helps with this, because obviously if you're in a situation where it's a uphill battle, you don't want any damage that you do to get, removed. So you want things like prevent monster heal. You want things like open wounds. You want things like poison. These things will prevent the monster from regenerating when you run away to heal yourself, so that it's not a war of attrition, basically, where the monster's healing and you're healing, and he heals more than you, so you never win. Right? You should always be able to win a Thorns encounter if you do it properly. If you don't do it properly, you're just going to die. Mercenaries. Mercenaries are the same as players. So mercenaries also have to deal with the same problems that the player does, which means that they have to avoid physical damage. There are some ways that you can make non-physical melee mercs, but the unfortunate side effect of that is that they really can't heal themselves, because the primary method that mercs heal themselves with is leech. My suggestion to most people for these upcoming seasons is to avoid melee mercs in general. In fact, for the most part, for these heralds with the Thorns, you're better off with a Act 1 merc. And why? Because as we learned, ranged attacks do not reflect, right? Because the Act 1 merc is ranged, which means that she will actually be able to leech. So she can leech as a ranged character. She can dish out melee damage or physical damage, and she can actually leech, and she can keep herself alive. She's going to be far more useful to you than the melee merc is. And you can put insight on the bow girl. So using an insight bow girl, or a vigor bow girl, or faith merc, or there's a bunch of different options that you can do for the Act 1. Another good option is the Act 3 merc. The Act 3 merc is, of course, spell-based, and you can set them up specifically for their spell. So in the case of the Act 3 merc, you have many options. You have the cold option, which is good for crowd control, but also the hardest to break any resistances for. You have the fire version, which there's tons of immunities for fire, but they aren't horrible to break, and then you got the lightning. My personal opinion, if you're a melee character, I would go with the Act 3 merc, because the enchant is absolutely amazing and give tons of attack rating, which is beautiful. They tend to be pretty powerful as well if you set them up properly with the appropriate equipment, and you can beef up their enchant to be absolutely insane, so you just get a massive amount of attack rating bonus. But the Act 1 merc generally tends to win out in a lot of situations. It really depends on what character you're building. However, if you were to try and build a mercenary that could potentially tank and survive Thorns, you would have to avoid physical damage. So you would have to set up a mercenary like an Act 5 or an Act 3 mercenary, which is doing primarily elemental damage. There are ways that you could potentially do this. Like, for instance, doing double Crescent Moon phase blades could be interesting. It's low physical damage, but very high elemental. They might still end up killing themselves, though. Double Lawbringer is an odd choice, but has no physical damage, but lots of elemental damage. You can also potentially try and get them a large amount of attacker takes damage reduction, basically. So MDR and DR. So DR specifically, damage reduced by 20 on Gladiator's Bane, will actually reduce the incoming damage of the attacker takes damage of. You can get a large amount of attacker takes damage basically reduction, so DR reduction and physical damage reduction, which could potentially offset the Thorns. Although I really just don't know if the physical damage characters are even going to be able to survive Thorns for the most part. It really kind of shifts the meta away from the Act 5 and the Act 3 Merc, or Act 2 Merc, more toward the Act 1 and the Act 3 Merc, because the Herald Thorns just will instantly KO them whenever they pop up, unfortunately. Trying to think if there's anything else really to cover for this. I don't think so. I think we've pretty much gone over everything. We've talked about the Thorns themselves. We talked about the Reflect. We talked about the attacker takes damage of. We talked about how to avoid both of these. And in general, all the various methods that you can potentially use to overcome them. It doesn't completely invalidate a physical damage melee character. In fact, physical damage melee characters are still extremely strong. The thing is that you just need an alternative method for dealing with the Thorns characters, and it can be done. You can come up with a large number of alternative methods, and I think it makes the game extremely fun, in my opinion, to come up with those alternative methods so that you understand the best ways to be able to deal with those monsters when they do arise. And it sounds like this season's going to be a very popular one for Heralds, so we're going to be seeing a lot of Thorns Heralds in the process. And if you're trying to set up an actual Thorns character, for instance, like say, you watch this video and you're like, I would really like to set up a character based around Thorns. Well, one of the things that you may want to know is that the Warlock ability, known as Rancor, is actually really good for Reflection Thorns. The reason is because Rancor increases the attack speed of the monsters and increases their damage, which increases overall the reflected damage and speed at which it occurs. And this is really good because you could essentially utilize the Rancor ability alongside of amplified damage as an actual Thorns character, and you could get some pretty crazy numbers. In fact, that's another potential way that you could just simply deal with the problem. Thorns cannot be reflected by Thorns. So if you have a Thorns character who is set up properly, you can just let the Herald hit you and kill himself. It really depends on how much Thorns you can potentially get. You can make some pretty crazy Thorns characters. The Warlock can be an absolutely insane Thorns character. So can the Druid, the Paladin. There's a decent opportunity for the Necromancer with all of his minions. You can essentially just reflect things. And that's another thing, is you can use minions to your advantage in that case too, to keep the monster away from you and let the monster deal Thorns damage to themselves. I think that's pretty much it. As always, I appreciate you guys and gals watching, even when I'm just yakking for like 30 minutes about Thorns. Hopefully I've taught you something about Thorns. If you have any questions about some specifics about how Thorns works, or how attacker takes damage of works, or how they combine together, just let me know down in the comments and I'll do my best to try and answer whatever questions you have. As always, keep watching.